Hello again. My name is Sam Robinson, and I am the Gnostic syncretist. Thank you for joining me tonight. As always, I'd like to reiterate and restate that all are welcome on this channel, no matter your background or your belief systems, because we are all seeking to figure out the very nature of our reality, and thus all seekers of truth are absolutely welcome on this channel. So thank you for joining us tonight. In our last two videos, we were going over not only the suppression of the Gnostic tradition at the end of the Roman Empire, but we also covered the absolute amazing discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in Upper Egypt during 1945, which utterly reconstituted what we knew about the Gnostic traditions in general. For up until that time, there were very, very few accounts of the Gnostics. A few of these accounts would have been the Pistis Sophia, which some people wanted to know what that was. This is the Pistis Sophia. This is a book written by a theosophist, the former assistant of H.P. Blavatsky, who was the founder of Theosophy, G.R.S. Mead, who did an amazing job on translating and providing commentaries on the Pistis Sophia, as well as writing another major book called The Echoes from the Gnosis, also written by G.R.S. Mead, where he dives into I think it's 13 or maybe 18 books or tracts or codices, however you want to refer to them, of the ancient Gnostics, some coming from the Corpus Hermeticum, some coming from various others that were found over the ages, like the Gospel of Truth and several different Hermetic hymns, as well as accounts from the few manuscripts that made it down to his era, because he did not make it into 1945. He died several decades before that, before any of the Nag Hammadi records were discovered and translated, for they would have absolutely illuminated much of his research into the Gnostic traditions and the path of Gnosis itself. But we still have much to thank G.R.S. Mead for when it comes to traditional Gnosticism up until the early 1900s, when he wrote these several books. So we also covered the tradition of Valentinus or Valentinian Gnosticism, and how they largely differed and had several unique concepts within their Gnostic tradition, such as the concept of a form of collective gnosis being utilized as an activity to reconstitute the cosmic order of equilibrium that started to fall into entropy after the fall of Sophia, or the plunge of the Aeon Sophia out of the pleroma into chaos and chaotic matter, which is referred to them as Hyle or Hylic matter, which means gross matter, which according to them did not exist before this plunge out of the pleroma by Sophia and her encounter with chaos. So we also covered how they differentiated three human archetypes that they referred to as the pneumatic, the psychic, and the Hylic type of human being. And in these three types were distinct potentials of spirituality and divinity, with the pneumatic being the highest type, the psychic being a stage in between with many of the latent potentialities of the pneumatic, and then the Hylic human being who is totally encased in gross matter and lives in almost in complete illusion and is largely irredeemable, at least in that current incarnation, though they postulate that if in the future they may become reincarnated into one of the two higher types, the pneumatic or the psychic archetype of a human being, and thus then become able to engage in the path of gnosis and spiritual generation. One unique aspect of their form of gnosis was this idea, very similar to Kabbalah and some, or at least some Kabbalistic traditions, that the act of gnosis, if engaged in by the entirety of the human race, would redeem the material plane in its entirety once fully completed, with the monadic divine shards and or essences that come from the pleroma realm being redeemed with them, and thus eventually restoring the balance and the harmony and the equilibrium state that existed before her fall. Those are some quite unique aspects to the school of Valentinus, and definitely worth noting because they differ from some of the others. Now, what I'd like to really go back into, however, is the destruction of Gnosticism in general, as well as the ancient pagan mystery schools that occurred near the end of the Roman era. So, in general, this has not always been widely known, but there are many historical scholars, and I have a background in history, I have my degree in history, a lot of it revolving around the ancient and medieval period, as well as ancient philosophy. Ancient Gnosticism and the esoteric or sacred mystery school traditions that included Eleusis, the Orphic tradition, the tradition of the Druids in Celtic Ireland, as well as Great Britain, before it was Great Britain, obviously, and the Egyptian mystery tradition, the Bacchic or Dionysian mystery school tradition, the mysteries of Adonis and Attis, who are roughly interchangeable um, personas, and the Kabiric, the mysteries of the Kabiri, which is an extremely mysterious group of initiates, because not much has come down to us over the centuries, because obviously most of these were given a vow of silence, and theirs was so complete that we really don't know much at all about the Kabirian mystery schools. However, we know much about the others. So the pagan mystery school traditions and the Gnostic school mystery traditions really are the focal point and keynote of the ancient world of philosophical and spiritual antiquity, and their amazing level of knowledge and spiritual concepts that they melded together, not only in Alexandria but in other parts of the Roman Empire during the centuries, roughly from the time of the advent of the Roman Empire with Augustus Caesar at the beginning of the era, all the way up through what you could say would be the beginning of the Dark Ages, around 415 AD, when the Gnostic scholar Hypatia was summarily butchered in the streets by a mob of fanatical Christians who were absolutely zealous in their hatred of anything non-Christian. So, which was incited by Peter the Mad, who worked for the Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. And I don't think I can harp on it enough that the end result of the destruction of Gnosticism and the pagan mystery schools was fundamental to setting humanity back for over 1,000 years, until what's called the Enlightenment era or the Renaissance, which you could postulate started after the Medici House of Venice sent out individual scholars to find, procure, and bring back various types of knowledge that had been seemingly lost to the European continent for centuries and centuries, that had been either summarily destroyed or simply removed and taken into hiding by whomever it was, individuals who took them off to the Middle East, and they stayed alive in the Middle East, in areas like Iran or Iraq, for a very long time, like the Platonic philosophy, and the Neoplatonic philosophy, as well as Aristotle and the Corpus Hermeticum, or the Hermetic treatises, which eventually Medici got a hold of and had them start translating it, though it is well known that once the Hermetic texts were discovered and brought back to him, Cosimo de' Medici demanded that whatever translations you were working on, which I think they were working on Plato and Aristotle at the time, to be halted and to immediately start translating the Hermetic texts instead, which resulted, you could say, in a large part, with all those translated over time, the beginning of the Enlightenment era and the Renaissance. But due to the nature of what occurred after Constantine and his Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when Roman Catholic Christianity became the religion of the empire, there was a large amount of religious competition once that occurred. And I know the Christians like to talk about how much they were, suppressed and were, bigoted against and were burned alive by Nero, Caesar, and how they had to go into hiding for many centuries, which is not entirely the case. By the way, yes, Nero did, of course, burn Christians on his front lawn, and so did some other Caesars. However, they were not obviously they were clearly not completely blotted out, because they continued to thrive at the same time as the Gnostics started to thrive as well. Now, some claim the Gnostics go back even further, but they didn't come out into the open until the advent of this Abrahamic tradition that they saw as a false religion with a false demiurgic deity at the center of it. That was Yaldabaoth, the deceiving false personator of the great absolute, the great God without name. So at the time that they were supposedly being suppressed, they were also having religious debates and discussions with people like Valentinus, people like Basilides, who was from Alexandria, and many other Gnostic scholars. So by the time you get to the Constantinian era and the advent of Roman Catholicism as becoming legal and the principal religion of the empire, things started to change quite a lot, and dramatically and rapidly. Over the next 4 to 6 decades, you had an extreme level of religious competitorship between the mystery school of Mithra or Mithraism, the schools of Valentinus, the schools of Basilides, the Basilides school, Basilidean Gnosticism largely remained insulated within Egypt itself, specifically around Alexandria. But Valentinus and his form of Gnosticism had gone all over the Roman Empire, in Syria, North Africa, and the Near East, and Palestine, and Asia Minor. So, and then you also had the mysteries of the other pagan schools, such as Eleusis and Orpheus and Dionysus and Bacchus and Mithra, and all these were in a form of competition. And eventually, and inevitably, 4 to 6 decades after Constantine, you have Theodosius II, called the Great. He's not that great except at destroying things. And Theodosius II is the one who issued a set of decrees around 387 AD, which effectively outlawed all forms of Gnosticism, Mithraism, and anything that was non-Christian or pagan in a form of worship, religious sacrament, religious rite, or school of thought in general. A lot of people don't understand or realize, or have not actually been taught, that the pre-Christian pagan mystery schools, some of them definitely resided around the same time as the rise of Christianity, as well as the Gnostic schools, were an utter threat to Roman Christianity. And it's not hard to see why. Roman Christianity could barely, let me not mince words, they couldn't hold a candle spiritually, cosmologically, philosophically to these various mystery schools and their concepts and conceptualizations and spiritual philosophies. They were far more advanced. They had much longer period to become advanced, especially with the pagan mystery schools that go back to, the era of Plato. You had the Neoplatonists, you had all these others. They couldn't hold a candle. And when they debated or had discussions or, engaged in scholarly disputes, they got crushed every time. Now, a lot of that record of these debates do not come down to us, but the level of vehemence shown and rendered upon the different mystery schools by the church fathers during the rise of Christianity, during the time after it became the Roman religion of choice, and at the end of the pagan era, was full of total vehemence, hatred, and was considered to be heresy by many of these fathers, from Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, um, eventually Origen, who was a former initiate. They all could not have been more bigoted against these belief systems because they saw them as essentially a religious and philosophical threat to their paradigm, because they could not stand their ground when it came to a debate. They could not stand up on their own principles because they were too convoluted, too haphazard, too random, too foreign in many ways, which is exactly why the Christians and the councils of Nicaea and the other ones that were after it totally pilfered the mystery school traditions and rites and ceremonies and celebratory dates from these schools after having wiped them out and used them for their own. Many people don't know this. I didn't know this growing up. The Christian birthday of Jesus Christ is considered to be December 25th. Well, what falls around that as well? The winter solstice. But what many don't know, they may know that, they don't know that originally Mithra was considered to have been born on January 6th, but then was altered to December 25th to be closer to the winter solstice. Now, many don't know that Mithra and the cult of Mithra celebrated the birth of their deity, their sun god, their, their light-based logos, and the same days the Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Many don't know a lot of the similarities between Mithraism and Gnosticism and their different rites and rituals that have been allocated to the Christian religion without any, notation that this is where it originally came from. Obviously, why would they? Because they destroyed them, so thus they can't really speak out against their concepts and their systems of rituals and dates being taken from them because they've been wiped out. So there's the Christmas tree that comes from another mystery school tradition, which is the one of Adonis or Attis, in which this solar deity, it's in what's called a dying god mythos. There were a bunch of these in the mystery schools, but this one specifically, not only was that person born on the 25th, but also also on that same period, he was considered to have either been gored to death by I think it's a pig, or maybe even a bull. I think it's a boar actually, in front of a pine tree, or to have emasculated himself in front of a pine tree. And then his mother, I think it's Kaibili, ended up instituting a celebration ritual at the time that this occurred during the year, which is considered December 25th. Many people don't know that their Christmas tree comes from an ancient pagan ritual celebration of the ancient god Attis Adonis, who looks very similar to Jesus, had the same ceremonial dates applied to them, though obviously the stories are quite different, but they also are redeemers of mankind, just not in the more literal sense, in a more abstract sense. But your Christmas tree concept comes from these ancient mystery schools. So let there be no mistake that the Christians stole most of their, you can't really say they stole, but they kind of stole their ideas from these pagan and Gnostic mystery schools, and then took them as their own, because obviously it's much easier to propagate a new religious form of worship and tradition if many of your new adherents don't actually have to alter any of their sacred holidays and days of the year, or even the ritual acts associated with them. And thus it made it far easier to accommodate Christianity as a new concept and a new tradition amongst the laity of the pagans if you utilize the ones that they already had been exhibiting for centuries already. And thus that's what they did. And then it worked very well. However, they still were not winning when it came to the competition between religious traditions. They just were not, Mithraism specifically, as well as Gnosticism of Valentinus and some others, were absolutely holding their own against the rise of Christianity. And thus, summarily, they become outlawed and heresy by Theodosius II, Emperor of Rome. And after 387, the total destruction of the mystery schools begins, which is easily what caused the Dark Ages. I mean, absolutely, unequivocally caused the Dark Ages. Because one of the other things a lot of people have not been taught and do not realize, and it's clearly to a degree kept hidden or even unconsciously ignored, is that they began burning books and destroying temples and destroying artifacts all over Rome, all over the Roman Empire, not just in Italy, but everywhere, after this decree in 387 by Theodosius, which allowed them to begin the total destruction of the esoteric mystery school traditions, from Gnosticism to Mithraism to the mysteries of Eleusis and all the others. So once this decree was put in place and Gnosticism and paganism were considered illegal, the natural byproduct of such a decree is the allocation of indirect power to any random Christian or mobs of Christians to engage in a systematic destruction of any form or relic they could find of these now illegal traditions in the Roman Empire. And that's what they did. You had roaming bands of fanatical Christians for the next 150 to 200 years, scouring the remains of the Roman Empire for any form of pagan items or temples or adherents or texts, and they destroyed them. This is why so little comes down to us, actually, from this time period and from these great spiritual philosophies in their schools, is the Christians obliterated them. Now, specifically, there's nothing that compares to the level of destruction incurred upon the Gnostic tradition. It was completely destroyed. They were wiped from the face of existence, which is why we have so little until the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 in Upper Egypt, when that clay tablet of works and books and scrolls was found hidden in a clay jar that had clearly been buried in the 4th century, probably the late 4th century, to protect these documents from destruction by the Christians. And it's amazing that they succeeded, actually. It's amazing that they were ever rediscovered, but they were. And so, and nowadays in our era, there's a kind of Gnostic renaissance occurring, and many people are now interested in this tradition. However, the caveat is they're not really Christian. A lot of people think that Gnostics are Christian. They're not Christian. They're esoteric and what you would call pagan, though that's really a misnomer. But they're not Christian. Now, there is a being in many of these cosmologies called the Christos, which is not Jesus. It's the Christos. And Jesus also appears in many of these Gnostic traditions as well, and in many codices in the Nag Hammadi library. But it's a very different Jesus, and it's a very different Christos in Christ. And for that very reason, they had to be obliterated. But beyond all that, probably the most and most prominent reason for destroying the Gnostics, their tradition, their temples and adherents, and really just their ideas, was a very specific concept, which was about how they saw the Abrahamic tradition and their deity, Yahweh Jehovah. They considered Yahweh Jehovah to be absolutely the very same demiurgic Yaldabaoth and the chief and Lord Archon of the Gnostic cosmology. And a bunch of them thought this, and they thought that essentially the Abrahamic tradition, I guess you would call them specifically the Jews and the Christians, the Judeo-Christian tradition, was following what they referred to as a false deity or pseudo-god who was claiming to be the highest deity in existence when he's really only a secondary power. And in their tradition, you can see that. It's very plain. Not every one of them thought he was bad, but they all thought that he was only, at best, one of the secondary powers of creation and maybe chief ruler of the material planes, but not of the pleroma, not of the highest spiritual planes, and clearly not Bythos or the unknown, unnamed absolute creator who emanates the cosmos. He's not that. And on top of that, when they refer to their highest deity in Gnosticism, there's no name. And it's an asexual deity. It's not male, it's not female, but the essence of both gender types, just as in all esoteric traditions, whether it's Hermeticism or Theosophy or Anthroposophy or the Mysteries of Eleusis. Every one of these ancient mystery schools and current mystery schools and occult traditions inherently refers to the absolute as unmanifested, asexual, and containing the essence of both the God, the Father God, and the Mother God, combined together, you could say, in a yin-yang, which has both encased in a circle, the circle being the entire being, and it's two types. It's two aspects that then manifest in a multitude of aspects below, or emanate into them, which is, in the Gnostic tradition, what are referred to as the aeonic beings, the aeons. And each one of them, in the Gnostic tradition, is also a couple, or a set of bifurcated attributes as couples called syzygies, which are male and female pairs that work together to perform the action of emanation and creation, which is allocated to them by the Absolute, because the Absolute is never engaged in creation or in. And I mean, one of the best reasons for this is it's so far beyond it as a philosophical idea that creation is almost, in a sense, beneath the idea of the absolute. It's the absolute. And to further accentuate that point, it's an impersonal deity. It has to be. Because a personalized deity is far more like the Abrahamic one of Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, where it has emotionality, it has anger and great vengeance and hatred, and in the Old Testament, orders the orders Moses and many of the Judaic leaders to commit essentially genocide on the Canaanites and various other cultures as they war about the Middle East before they find and take over Palestine. Well, they had to wipe everybody out first. So, what does that tell you? Well, that tells you this is clearly not the absolute. This is a personalized, what they call tribal deity of the Judaic tradition that then was adopted by the Christians, which is one of the strangest occurrences in the history of religion to me, that the Judaic tradition had a derivative called Christianity, which is so completely the opposite and antithetical to the God of the Old Testament. The God of the New Testament, which they claim is Jesus, I claim otherwise, could not be more different than the God of the Old Testament who engages in mass genocide and annihilation of peoples, ritual human sacrifice, and as well as child sacrifice, and many other atrocities in the Old Testament that are attributed to this God, commanding them to do. And they do it without hesitation. There's even, I'm pretty sure, a command by their deity, Yahweh, or Jehovah, however you want to call this deity, this false god, tells, I'm pretty sure it's Moses, to at some point kill, that they'd done something that blasphemed against him or did something that upset the deity, and he tells Moses to line up his people and to murder every fifth person. So 1/5 of all the Israelites were then summarily murdered by I think it was Moses. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was Moses. Where he just goes down the line and every fifth person just done, executed. Now, does that sound like Jesus? For one, does that sound like the great, benevolent, beneficent God of the New Testament? 2, does that sound like a good God in general? 3, or does that sound like a demented false God to you? That's what it sounds like to me. And God, so to me, it's mind-boggling as someone who did grow up in the Protestant Church of Presbyterianism, found my way out into what you could call agnosticism and then a form of deism, which is what the founding fathers considered themselves, and then into Gnosticism and then the rest of the esoteric traditions. But I've remained largely Gnostic in my overtone. What blows me away is the commingling of the New and Old Testament, because it couldn't be more different. Their divergence is almost total in philosophy and spirituality, in ethics and morality. They're antithetical to each other. However, the only thing I can gather from the people that I know that are Christians, Catholics, and various Protestant Christians is that the Old Testament has prophets, and these prophets told prophecies that foresaw the coming of the great Redeemer, the Christ. I don't think it's named Christ in the Old Testament, but they saw the coming Redeemer of the Jews, these prophets. Obviously, this is subject to enormous levels of misinterpretation, misrepresentation, mistranslation. So who knows what they were really referring to? And I have these prophets chastise their very own people for destroying and blaspheming against the laws of their deity many times. However, as far as I've been able to gather over the years, Christians cannot bring themselves to sever their ties to the Old Testament Abrahamic deity or tradition, mainly because the pivotal aspect of the prophetic nature that leads to their Savior God, Jesus Christ, in the New Testament. Regardless of the fact that their Savior God, their Savior, Jesus Christ, would have utterly and eviscerated that tradition, as he did. I mean, there are many supposed recorded incidences of this, where he called out the various priestly hierarchy classes for their blasphemies, their dogmatism, their bigotry, and their heresies. I'm speaking obviously of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Where he attacks the tax collectors and goes in the temple and knocks the table down and, calls everybody out, which would lead one to believe that clearly he had severed himself, if he was Jewish, from the Old Testament deity and Old Testament dogmas. But due to the nature of these various councils, like the Council of Nicaea in 325 and all the others that come after it, where they constructed and curated what's considered to be the Holy Bible now, and they put the two together, the Old and New Testament, it's now become, so to speak, absolute law that they must be a combined book, which is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Because really, you should just cut that book in half and keep your half and give the other half to the Judaic people and their old deity. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Christians cling on to the Old Testament, and you couldn't pry their fingers off if you tried. And therefore, the Gnostic traditions are absolutely correct when they claim that the Abrahamic tradition is worshiping a false deity, whether it's Yaldabaoth or not. It's clearly not a benevolent deity. He may have chosen you, but he also chose many of you that had to be killed by your own people and leaders over the centuries in your own books. And he chose out others to be annihilated completely so that you could take some land. Not benevolence at all. Atrocities in general. And therefore, because the Gnostic tradition completely and utterly attacks this false deity as they see it, they had to be annihilated. They had to be totally wiped from the face of the earth. All their texts had to be destroyed, and all their adherents had to be executed, and all their temples burned down, and all their relics obliterated, though some have still come down to us. I mean, this is the primary reason that I see why the Gnostics were wiped out. And this led to the Dark Ages. It absolutely led to the Dark Ages. Not only their destruction, but the destruction of everything that was non-Christian. I mean, people, say the fall of Rome led to the Dark Ages. I mean, there's cases to be made for that. It clearly was a huge factor. Nonetheless, the destruction of all knowledge that was not related to Christian concepts or Christian texts or religious ideas by decree of the Roman emperors inevitably and invariably led to the destruction of much of the highest achievements of philosophy and mathematics and systematic reasoning and rationality that was inherent to all these traditions of the Gnostics and the pagan mystery schools. The decreed destruction of these forms of knowledge could only lead to one thing: an intellectual and spiritual and philosophical dark age. Now, the fact that it lasted for well over 1,000 years is quite remarkable. And, you had the two accounts where the Gnostics seemed to resurface in some form. Some have claimed that the Knights Templar were Gnostics. And then you have what's considered the Cathars or Albigensians, which was a tradition during the Middle Ages that was supposedly Gnostic in orientation. Not only did they allow women and men to worship together and both be priests, something totally unique to the mystery schools, which allowed both male and female initiates and advocates and teachers, which clearly the Christians in the Abrahamic tradition did not like at all. That's why they destroyed their divine feminine counterparts. The Jews actually had one initially, and I think it was Shekinah. Let's be real. The Judaic people, the Hebrews of the Old Testament, worshipped many gods. They worshipped Moloch, they worshipped Baal, they worshipped Astarte, which is a version of Isis, which is a version of Inanna, depends on which tradition you want to go back to. Nonetheless, they worshipped both male and female deities until the codification of their books after the Babylonian exile and after their reconstitution, which is when the Old Testament was written, which is the beginning of the second half of the millennium before the current era. So in the around 400 BC, roughly speaking, which by then they totally eliminated any level of divine feminine presence or concepts from their tradition entirely, which then led to what? A masculine only father figure as a deity, which then was inherited by the Christians who only have a father God, which is a one-dimensional concept, which is part of the reason that they have issues. Yes, they say they have Mother Mary and, whatever. Mother Mary is a reiteration of Isis, Inanna, and any other, whatever, ancient mother goddess you want to refer to. There's a whole bunch of them across the ancient world and all the different cultures. That's just Mary. They have the same symbols as Isis. Horus and Isis sitting there with her standing on a crescent moon is the exact same symbol that you see of the Madonna. Actually, some of those shrines are actually Isis shrines. Period. It's been determined to be the case. I can't give you which ones they are, but that's the case. So, the downfall of the mystery schools and the Gnostic schools just utterly snuffed out the light of freedom and intellectual thought and intellectual endeavors and intellectual experimentation and exposition and philosophical rationalization. It had to go. It had to be snuffed out for the rise of the Catholic tradition to reign supreme. And they were legally allowed to do it, and so they did it. And then they spent the next few hundred years wiping them out completely, to the point where there were almost no texts whatsoever left to us until the Nag Hammadi findings. Even the Platonic and Neoplatonic and Hermetic texts were lost for a long time. Now, they were kept alive in the Middle East, as we call it today, by certain groups who also had to guard them against Islamic destruction as well. But let us be completely clear and unequivocal. It was the Christians who thought that all this knowledge absolutely had to go. And Islam didn't come for 2.5 centuries after the downfall of the mystery schools, the death of Hypatia in 415, and the onset of the dark age of spiritual philosophy and intellectual endeavor in general in the Roman Empire and after. Islam didn't come till 2.5 centuries later, and they had already done the job. They'd already done the job well as far as they were concerned. And even today, I know many Christians and Catholics who, if you bring this up to them, they would declare that they did a dang good job, that they did what was right. Those were heresies. That was pagan, as if they really know what that word means anyway, when you question them on that as well. But that it was a job well done. Thank God we got the job done. And we wiped them out. And we wiped out all that information. Well, you didn't get the job done. It's still with us today. you failed in the end. And then hopefully a new Gnostic renaissance is upon us in this day and age, especially since the Nag Hammadi discovery. And not to mention, they're clearly not the only religion on earth. They did not succeed. They did not convert everybody in the world, just like Islam didn't. The Abrahamic traditions have not been totally successful to wiping from the face of the earth everything non-Abrahamic, though that's not for a lack of trying. And in all honesty, I don't think esoteric truth can be obliterated completely. The seeds of these archaic truths and mysteries will always be retained by humanity in whatever form and in whatever place. They're always guarded by the mystery traditions. And that is why we still have this information with us today. So, because people seem to be interested in these mystery schools' destruction, the destruction of Gnosticism and the pagan mystery schools, in general, I wanted to once again go over the nature, the significance, and the totality that occurred of this Christian destruction of these different traditions, and how nearly complete it was, how extremely fanatical it was, and the level of systematic methodology that they utilized to try to snuff all of it out. I mean, they were hardcore to wipe these out, and thankfully they did not succeed. We are able to dive into these today, thanks to the bravery and the ingenuity of the individuals that kept these alive. The one that placed them in the Nag Hammadi area in that clay container, and the rest of them, the nameless ones, who took these out of the Roman Empire and guarded them in whatever place that they did, to where they came back to us in the Enlightenment era. But it took 1,000 years. And even later, up until the Theosophical era of the second half of the 19th century, for much of this to actually come back to the public domain. There were individuals that could get a hold of it, but not necessarily the public. And today, you have the internet and all these different accessible libraries to order from to get these texts. So go out there and get them, everybody, because they are available. A lot of them are so old and non-patented that they are completely free as downloadable PDFs or ebooks online on Kindle or various platforms. So take advantage of the knowledge left to us by these hierophants and initiates in the depths of antiquities mystery schools, because there's no better time than today to be able to access all these as a public individual in the public domain for very cheap. 100 years ago, it was very expensive. So once again, my name is Sam Robinson. Thank you for watching this. This has been an overview, once again, and a deeper dive into the destruction of Gnosticism and the ancient mystery school traditions by Christianity, Roman Catholic Christianity. And we are fortunate to have what we have still today, as fragmentary as it is. My name is Sam Robinson. I am the Gnostic syncretist. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and share this around. We will be doing more videos very soon.